Are these on? Oh, this is on. Okay. Hi, Mitch, are we good on stream? We're ready to go? Okay, we're live? Awesome. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us as we're having some minor technical difficulties that have been mostly resolved. I want to thank you guys for coming out. So this is part of our Evening at Egan series. Some of you, I recognize your faces, you're regulars. I love that. For those who maybe this is your first time, you've never heard of this before, you just saw a flyer around town and wanted to check it out. Evening at Egan is a regular fall lecture series we do here at UAS. We try to bring in multiple different viewpoints, multiple different topics of like researchers, scientists, like authors, writers, artists, creators, really anyone kind of adjacent to UAS who wants to share their work. So we really try to get a lot of different topics, a lot of different viewpoints mixed in here. We usually run these every month in the fall. They're usually, well, they're always on a Friday at 7 p.m. like we are here now. So this is our third one of the season. So thank you guys for coming out, and thanks you for everyone joining in on the Zoom. My name is Dallas. I'm an academic advisor here at UAS. I work in our School of Arts and Sciences, and I'm in charge tonight. A couple quick housekeeping things before we get started with the talk here. So we do have coffee and cookies in the back if you need a snack, something to drink. I will also draw your attention to the exit in the back. If there is an emergency we have to evacuate, there is a door back there. That's going to be the nearest one. It is alarmed though, so if you're just leaving for normal reasons, don't use that one, please. You'll have to go upstairs. There's an elevator in the back there or the stairs. And then the restrooms are going to be right through the stacks here. They're on that back wall, and there's a sign and a water fountain in front of them, so you know where they are as well. Okay, so before we get started, I also want to read our land acknowledgement here at UAS. This is a very important thing to our mission to acknowledge the land we're on and the cultures we are intermingling with here. So our campuses reside on the unceded territories of the Aquan, Tontaquan, and Chickaquan on Lingadani, also known as Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka, Alaska. We acknowledge that Tlingit peoples have been stewards of the land on which we work and reside since time immemorial, and we're grateful for all that stewardship and incredible care. We also recognize that our campuses are adjacent to the ancestral home of the Kharas and Tsimshian people, and we commit to serving their peoples with equity and care. We recognize the series of unjust actions that have attempted to remove them from their land, which includes forced relocations and the burning of villages. We honor the relationships that exist between Tlingit, Kharas, and Tsimshian people and their sovereign relationships to their lands, their languages, their ancestors, and future generations. We aspire to work toward healing and liberation, recognizing that our paths are intertwined in the complex histories of colonialization in Alaska. We acknowledge that we arrived here by listening to the peoples, elders, and lessons from the past, and that these stories carry us as we weave a healthier world for future generations. So for this talk, in a moment, I'm going to introduce Dr. Julie Schramm, who's one of our assistant professors of animal physiology here at UAS, and then she'll introduce our speaker. Then we'll have our talk, and then at the end, we'll have a short time for Q&A for questions. I'll be running a mic around so you can be heard on the Zoom, so please wait till you get the microphone to ask your questions. But yeah, really hoping to just make this an interesting and generative discussion about our topic. All right? Thumbs up? We like that. Okay. All right, so Julie, if you want to come on up here and just introduce our speaker. Yay, Julie, clap for Julie.
Thanks, Dallas. All right, can you all hear me? Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm actually really excited to hear Skylar's talk. I think we've been emailing for about a year now. I tried to get her to come and give a talk for a seminar series that I was teaching because I heard about the book that she co-edited, and I got to read some of it, and it's full of first-person narrative stories that are really amazing. They touch on things that I think everybody can relate to in one way or another. And so I've been really excited because I think these are really important stories that we need to hear and that students should get to hear too. So I'm going to keep it real brief. I'd like to introduce Dr. Bayer.
I'm ready to have my slides on the screen if you're ready. All right. Came out a little lighter than I hoped. Can everyone hear me okay with the mic? Okay, great. I'm going to tell you about This book, Uncharted, that's been mentioned a few times, some of the motivation behind it, how it came together. I'm going to also talk about a little bit about some of the quotes inside of it and where to go from there. But first, I want to give a land acknowledgement of my own coming from the NOAA Alaska Regional Office. This is a modified version of what we give. I acknowledge that I live and work on the indigenous homelands of Alaska's Native people who have been indigenous to this land for over 10,000 years, living their culture and tribal values as their ancestors and elders taught them. I acknowledge the tribes never relinquished their property rights or their ownership and stewardship of their land and waterways. I acknowledge that I live and work on Tlingit Ani. I want to thank each tribe, Gunishish, for their stewardship of their land and waterways since time immemorial. Thank you for your patience as we learn. So, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about myself. I have a PhD in marine biology, which is not the focus of today's talk, but I have this nice little Venn diagram, or at least I think it's nice, of my interest areas. Invertebrate biology and ecology is something I've been really passionate about since probably before college. And that's in the blue circle that you can see on the screen here. I think you guys can see my cursor. And then I have this green circle about harvesting, growing, and eating seafood, which is sort of its own set of circumstances and something I'm really interested in. And then human communication and connection is also something I'm really interested in. And so the overlap between human communication and connection, I tend to think of as overlaps with my invertebrate biology and ecology interests is like classic science communication, like, here's a cool fun fact, guys. Aren't squids so cool? And then when I think of the overlap with harvesting, growing, and eating, I think about engagement with community, with fishermen, with aquaculturists, with people who harvest and live off of the ocean, because that's where I work. And then in terms of my research interests, they tend to fall in line with shellfish, life history, and habitat. And that's where the blue and green overlap. And then where these three overlap, this little orange awkward box, I think of being really important in how we achieve research and management goals at places like NOAA, where I work, in the Habitat and Conservation Division. But today, I'm really going to focus on this human communication and connection part of my interest and my life and what I've been doing actually for quite a while now. And that's really focused on stories. So, how did I fall into the storytelling sea? Way back in 2013, I told a story for the Story Collider at a science communication conference. And the Story Collider is a nonprofit dedicated to telling stories that humanize science, that show that science is all around us. And it was at Miami, and I had a story about the first time I went in, and the only time I went in Alvin the submarine, which is a deep sea submarine. Like when saw the Titanic, it might sound familiar, but I used to work in deep sea work. And so I got to go 1.5 miles underwater, which was super cool. And I actually got to call my dad from the bottom of the ocean, which was a weird circumstantial thing, especially if he asked if there were any giant squid. And I was like, no, Dad, like giant squid don't live there. This isn't their habitat. But it was awkward because the entire ship could hear the whole conversation, right? Like all the guys on like the ship, all the guys in the submarine I was with, and probably other people that were just watching the dive. So I got to tell a story about this, and after that, I really got a taste for I really like stories, and the folks at Story Collider were like, oh, you're good at this, like, do you want to help produce stories? I'm like, what's producing? I don't know what that is. And so I really started investing, while also being a PhD student, time in understanding what narratives are, how to tell a good story, how to coach people, especially scientists, who like to talk a lot about data and less about their feelings. But guess what? Those feelings are really important in convincing us that data is real. So what is a story? And for any of you that's seen a series of unfortunate events, that's a little GIF up in the corner from that of Lemony Snicket retelling the tale of the poor children in that story. But it's an account of a series of events through time. So a bunch of things happened over a course of time. It's that simple. Stories or narratives improve our understanding. They're They're more interesting and engaging, they're more relatable, they influence our beliefs, and are frankly very, very persuasive. And if you don't believe me, read the social science literature, because they're really good at figuring that stuff out. That's why there's a reference at the bottom of this. And I'm not a social scientist or a psychologist, but I believe that they know what they're talking about. So why are stories really good? In short, humans are hardwired for stories. And there's plenty of literature on that. And this is a little gif of Leslie Knope being like, all I have on my side is facts and science. And it's a fact that we really like stories. I kind of harp on this because in a lot of talks I've given to mostly scientists, they're like, but I still don't understand why stories are important. And I'm like, take it from the psychologists and the sociologists. They really help with getting your points across. So, to bring it back to this book project, both Gabby and I, and these are pictures of me and actually my husband on stage telling a story for Story Collider, and a picture of Gabby Serrato Marks, who ends up being my co-editor for this book, about disability and chronic illness as scientists. When I was 25, I got diagnosed with a heart condition that required surgery for the insertion of what's called an internal cardioverter device, which is kind of like a pacemaker. It can shock you or moderate your heart. And I had one inserted. And the thing was, I was working in a scuba diving lab, and that ended my scuba career, just full stop. It was over. And at 25, really any age though, where you think that's going to be your career, it was a really big deal. And then Gabi got diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue autoimmune disorder where you're basically like too loose, is what I understand. And she did a lot of field work in caves, and that really affected her ability to go into caves and collect data for her research. And she was also very young. So the executive director of Story Collider reached out to me because I told a specific story about my heart condition at a Story Collider producers retreat. And she was like, you know what? That was such a great story, and I really think that you should like do something with this whole like disabilities and medical conditions while being a scientist in the field. She's like, Gabby told a story like that. You should go email Gabby and like do something. And so I did, because sometimes our friends come up with better ideas than we do about things we can do. And I got together with Gabby, and I said, let's do something, but let's not just talk about ourselves. Maybe we can hear from lots of people with experiences. There's got to be more folks that want to share their stories. And she's like, yeah, let's do something. Although we had no idea what we were doing because we'd never written a book. And I'm going to get a little bit into more of that process, but I kind of want to take a minute, well, more than a minute, probably a couple minutes, talking about disability and disability in STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math. So what is disability? According to the American with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, an individual with disability is defined as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or a person who has a history of record of such an impairment, or that they're simply perceived by others as having an impairment. So that's the American Disabilities Act definition. However, disability may be defined differently in different contexts, like insurance policies. But that is like a law level in the US. That's what a disability is. And I apologize, I realize this is on Google Slides right now and it doesn't have my animations to show you one bullet at a time. This might be problematic later on, but we're gonna keep going forward. So the CDC estimates that 27 of American adults are disabled. I actually think it's probably higher, especially after the pandemic. So that's at least 1 out of 4 people, probably closer to 1 out of 3. Some people identify as disabled, they like to use that word, but some people use chronic illness, or maybe they define themselves as having a medical condition, or maybe they call it something else or nothing at all. Disability can be temporary, sometimes it's permanent. Sometimes we don't know if it's gonna be permanent or temporary. There's a lot of uncertainty and diversity of how these conditions come and go, or just stay. And I'm thinking about the diversity of disability. I wanted to talk about the pride flag. Disability Pride is actually celebrated in July, and this flag that has these six colors show like the diversity of disability, or at least one way of it. Okay, some of my animation's working. So the black indicates the mourning of those that have died from negligence, suicide, rebellion, illness, and eugenics. Red indicates physical disabilities. Gold indicates neurodivergence. White is invisible and undiagnosed. Blue is psychiatric, and green is sensory. And so this is one way people will try to categorize disabilities. People can have multiple disabilities at the same time, or they pop up differently throughout their life. And some people might have a diagnosis, and honestly, a lot of people don't necessarily have diagnoses. Access to diagnosis and treatment is often a privilege, which people don't always realize. And that's partly why the statistic about 27% of Americans having disabilities is probably lower than it actually is. I wanted to just show you briefly what I could find about disability in Alaska. It's estimated that 29% of Alaskan adults are disabled, which is 1 in 3 about. And the categories from the source for this report, the way they break it up into groups is mobility, cognitive, whether or not they can independently live. Independent living actually means they can't live independently. Hearing, vision, and self-care. One of the reasons I show you this is because people can report disability in different ways. And I showed you the flag, but now this is how they're reporting it in Alaska. It means having a different and diverse perspective in our world. It doesn't just mean having an unsavory condition where you can't contribute anything to the world. You have a different spin on life, and I'll see some examples of that from the book. And Judy Heumann, who is a big activist, she says, disability only becomes a tragedy when society fails to provide the things needed to lead one's daily life. So that falls within what's called the social model of disability, which is basically saying that barriers to those with disabilities are caused by attitudes, infrastructural issues, and environmental conditions of society, as opposed to like, there's something wrong with you and you need to be fixed. And this is just a diagram on the left side of this slide that shows you the sort of the idea that the problem is the disabling world, not the other way around. A couple more concepts that I always think is important to bring up in this topic. And again, I'm approaching this as assuming you don't necessarily know that much about this topic. Ableism is broadly defined as discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. And this comes up a lot, and it often sneaks up on us because it's a really broad definition. So we may not realize that we're expressing a negative attitude or saying something offensive, or we're excluding people. And there's a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions that come up. And internalized ableism is actually something that comes up all the time. So for example, this is a really basic one where you're really sick, but you're like, I should still be able to go to work because work needs to happen instead of taking care of yourself. That's internalized ableism. Instead of being like, I am briefly disabled right now from being sick and I need to go take care of my body and heal and then go back to work, right? That's a simple example that I think we can all relate to. The other thing and concept that I think is really important when we talk about disability is intersectionality. And it's when a person's multiple social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. So you might be disabled, but that is also how you're treated, whether or not you get the care you deserve. All sorts of things that you experience in your life intersect with maybe your gender, maybe your race or ethnicity, maybe your religion, maybe your class, maybe your sexual orientation. So just because you're disabled doesn't mean your experience is the same as someone else that's disabled. There's a lot of different ways that you can experience the world because of how that identity intersects with your other identities. So, not all of those stories are the same. In terms of specifically talking about STEM, this is an NSF national survey from 2021, which actually to me seems like a long time ago. But this figure is a comparison between the 2011 and 2021 surveys of STEM. There's category for sex to see how things have changed in terms of percentage of the STEM workforce as female and male. Then there's a race and ethnicity set of columns to compare. And then there's a disability status. And I had to reread the report, but it was saying that the workforce total in the US, only 3% of the workforce identify as having one or more disabilities, which I thought was really, really low. And again, maybe not everyone wants to disclose or even know, but it seemed like a very low number. And then including STEM, it's 3% of the STEM workforce. And 2011 and 2021 have no difference whatsoever. So nothing's really changed in terms of that. And this data is from the Census Bureau's current population survey. So I think these reports tend to come out 1 year after the general census. So the next report of this would probably be 2031. Within that 3%, I actually made this figure because I didn't have a figure for this. They mentioned that contrary to popular belief, STEM workers with at least one disability are not overwhelmingly concentrated in older age groups, which I was surprised about too. But 18% of those that identified as having one or more disabilities were between 18 and 34 years old. 39% were 35 to 54, and then 43% were 55 to 74. So the majority, actually, of people who identify with disabilities are under 55. I don't know, I thought that was really interesting and actually reflects a lot of what we saw in our book in terms of contributors. We had a lot of young contributors in our book. And I really want to know what this would look like after accounting for the pandemic and the prevalence of long COVID that now exists in our communities. I do wonder how much this would change, as well as the other figure. Finally, just one other thing I wanted to point out. I just found this today. A lot of STEM doctorate recipients they found with disabilities experienced earning lower incomes than people who identified as non-disabled and are underrepresented among higher academic positions. So clearly being disabled has not helped at least some people move forward in their career as STEM professionals, especially in like faculty positions or high academic positions. So that research just came out last year. So given all these facts I just showed you, Gabby and I felt really motivated to start making space and giving voice to disability in STEM by creating this book. First, we were like, oh, should we do a website? Should we do a book? Well, we've never written a book, so we bought a book called How to Write a Book Proposal. That was like where we started. And so we were like, okay, well, this book idea might be a good idea because we can get lots of stories in one place, we can like publish it, and then maybe people will read it and they'll feel validated. So in 2018, that's when we started this project. We started gathering stories mostly from Twitter, actually. Now X, I call it the dead bird site because like if you look at the icons, it's like bird, and then it's X, so it's like the bird died. But that's actually where we found a lot of young disabled scientists is on Twitter. And we just put out Google Forms asking people to submit their ideas. And actually one of the first calls, we got quite a diversity of folks and conditions and stories. Although we did specifically look through the disabled in STEM community, there's a hashtag for that. I think it's still a pretty active community actually on X. And then we did do some specific seeking. Like, so for example, Twitter and some social media is not very friendly to people who are vision impaired or identify as blind. So we specifically sought out some blind contributors who we knew must exist, but we weren't finding them on social media. And we thought this was really important when we asked people to pitch. We specifically asked how their story would contribute to the diversity of disability and STEM stories. Okay, so we got all these pitches and we bought the how to write a book or book proposal book, but we were like, oh my God, no one knows who we are. So we took a step back and pitched an article idea to Scientific American about how our disabilities have actually made us better scientists. So for example, when I couldn't scuba dive anymore, I became a project management lead in my lab. So even though I couldn't go scuba diving, I planned all the dives. I was the boat person. I made sure everyone's tank was open and on, and I collected all the data and told people what to do, which is actually a really important skill long-term as a scientist running a lab or any other kind of organization. At the time, it felt really awful, but actually, as I went along with my PhD, I realized it was really, really important skill. And if I'd been diving all the time, I wouldn't have been able to gain those skills. So we published this piece in 2019. It actually got put into print. It was really exciting. And then shortly after, Gabby was approached by an editor at Columbia University Press asking if she had any book ideas. And we're like, oh boy, do we have one. So why did we pick the name Uncharted? Uncharted is a word that came to mind when we were thinking about scientific discovery as well as journeys of health. A chart is used in navigation. We both spent a lot of time on ships as marine biologists, so we really thought about navigating our course through the ocean. In science, right, you can make all sorts of charts. And then in medicine, and to be uncharted is to be off the map, excluded from the data, right? You're not being accounted for. And that's especially true in healthcare, right? When you're just that weird case that no one can seem to figure out what's wrong with you. And so what we did with this, to sort of go with how important narratives are in getting our sense of story across, we divided up into 6 sections, which were the stages of a nautical journey. So we have the getting underway section, where there are stories of people starting out in their careers, getting going. We have Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, which is really about people who are dealing with situations and conditions that never quite resolve themselves. They feel like they're kind of stuck. Then we have Rallying the Crew. All these stories have some connection to getting support from people in their lives, rallying the crew around them to help with their problems. In the heart of the maelstrom, a maelstrom's like a really bad storm. It's really about stories where people are getting through this really tough situation that's really specific. You're really zeroed in on this one situation that's really tumultuous, and there's some resolution at the end. Reflections in the Water are pieces where people tend to be thinking back on things that have happened, and sometimes there's an academic reflection, sometimes it's just oh wow, look at all the curves that happened in my life. And then finally we end the book with I Am the Captain of My Ship. In these stories, people have really taken ownership of their medical conditions and their disabilities and their life, and they feel like they really know who they are and where they're going and what they're doing. As you'll notice, none of these sections are divided up by disability type, by medical condition, by career stage, by any other demographic. And that's because we really wanted to focus in this book on people telling their story and not just being categorized. Because often that's the way we connect with people, is through their stories, not just by their data points. So this overwhelming body of text is all the stories. There's 32 of them. Gabby and I worked with every one of these people. 2 of these stories are ours, of course, so there's 30 people we worked with. There were people who dropped out of the project for one reason or the other, especially during COVID, but we thought that, this many stories was a pretty good, diverse set of stories. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a good start. So, okay. What I was going to do next is just give you a little bit of taste of each section. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what time it is because I don't have a clock in front of me, so I don't know how I'm doing on time. Oh, before questions? Oh, wow, okay. All right. Probably end early, but so Empho, he's really great. He's an astrologer, or no, not astrologer, sorry, astronomy. I know, I get those words mixed up. But he's working on his PhD in astronomy. He's in South Africa. We found him on Twitter. Really cool guy. And for him, getting a wheelchair was life-changing. He had a medical condition with his legs, and moving around in crutches was really hard. But getting a wheelchair was like life-altering for him. He could go to places more easily. Like there was just more access for him. And this is just like such a cool story because a lot of the time we'll hear stories of how a wheelchair kept someone back, but this was actually really important for him to be able to pursue his education as a scientist. So I'll read the quote from his story. "You see, this wheelchair would completely change my life. I would never have to worry about which foot to move forward, how to move it, how I should position my crutch to make sure I didn't find myself on the ground, and all the involuntary movements my peers didn't think twice about. This wheelchair meant I could focus on other aspects of my life, such as how to improve my performance at school." So I love his story, and I loved working with him because him and a lot of these contributors had never written a story like this before. All right, so from the next section, I'm just giving you sort of a taste of each section, but chapter 10, Hope is My Anchor by Furaha Asani. She lives in the UK, but she immigrated from Africa, and she has some paranoia and mental health conditions. There's a couple of them that she mentions in her story. And she's always sort of trying to figure out how to navigate through these mental health conditions in her life, especially when big events have happened and have really thrown her off kilter. But she talks a lot about hope in this story. "Perhaps one of the most important sparks of hope has come from the self-acceptance that my mind just functions the way it does, and I choose to hold space for myself and my imperfections. Hope is my anchor. I actively search for sparks of hope and collect them. I find these sparks in many different places: community, faith, and prayer, activism, family. I gather these ravenously and hold on to them through the storms." She really leaned into the Uncharted theme, the nautical journey, but we really appreciated that about her. She was great to work with. All right, rallying the crew. This is one of my favorite stories in the book called The Place I Rest by Alma C. Schrag. She's a deaf field biologist, and she has so much to say. She wrote like a 10,000 word piece or something, and we were just like, no, it has to be like 3,000 words or less. But she had so many wonderful things to say. So in this piece, she goes back and forth between these conferences she has to go to that are inaccessible to her because she can't hear and they never have like anyone to do sign language. And then she goes back to these field experiences with small groups of people in the middle of nowhere, like bear country, where people adapt to how she is and figure out ways to communicate with her. And this is about sort of one of those field pieces. "A slow osmosis seems to happen when I live and work in a small group of 6 people or fewer, particularly in remote places. This is one of the best things about remote fieldwork. In a matter of weeks, my coworkers gradually adjust to my deaf tempo. Sometimes grudgingly, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes intentionally, they become aware of communicating with someone whose perception of the environment is different from theirs." It's a really beautiful piece. One of the coolest things that she learned to do, they do bird counts, like they'd listen to the bird singing. She would read the sound waves on her phone. She put the phone on to listen, and she could figure out from how the waves looked to figure out which bird was calling. And then she'd compare notes with her, with the crew lead. It's really cool. In the Heart of the Maelstrom, so this piece, this is Wallace Alfred Russell Simonis. Wallace is the dog that Juniper has to help them through their PTSD, through life. They have a lot of mental health conditions. They disclose PTSD. I don't know about all the other ones, but one of the pieces of work that Juniper does is a lot of environmental chemical work, especially when there were a lot of protests in Portland. They went to the protests and collected samples of water to see the chemicals that were being thrown at people, to see what the environmental impacts of the chemicals that the police were throwing to disperse the crowd would be. And they would need to bring Wallace somewhere nearby because it's their service dog, but they also needed to keep their dog safe, and these were really dangerous situations, especially with the police. Occasionally, I guess police would like shoot people's dogs if they were nearby. So they would keep Wallace in a car sort of nearby, but with a note in it, letting people know that the dog was all right. So this is a quote from that story. Doing the science necessary to shine a public light on the impact of chemical weapons put both of us at substantially elevated risks. Working without Wallace by my side meant that I had a high risk of dissociating or having a severe anxiety attack that could render me incapable of keeping myself safe at a time when safety was paramount. And leaving Wallace alone made him vulnerable to being attacked and hurt by police. That's also I love all the stories, but all right, reflections in the water. This is a story from someone I think who ended up leaving science. She was finishing her PhD at the time, Emma, and she'd had a number of head trauma incidents that really affected her ability to deal with rooms with bright lights and other issues, and a lot of the lab spaces that she was asked to work in were inaccessible to her because she would get headaches and migraines and just couldn't stay in these spaces for very long. And she's also very sensitive to sounds. So this is a quote basically about why she's not lazy, or that she's doing the work that she's supposed to do, even though she's not participating in the same way everyone else in the lab is. I'm not lazy for taking the elevator instead of the stairs. I'm not unsociable because I refuse to attend inaccessible events. And I'm not unmotivated because I take time off to rest and recover from an inaccessible environment that the administration refuses to change. I should not have to display superhuman efficiency and resilience just to be allowed in the room. But I can't risk my mental and physical well-being while I wait for academia to decide that I'm worthwhile to keep around. All right, this is the final section. I am the captain of my ship, and I just love Gabby's story. I loved working with Gabby on this project. She was just such a great partner for this. But this is about when she's worked through a lot of her health conditions with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and she's going back to field work, and she's sort of figured out ways to work through it. It's still very painful for her, but she's still sort of completing these tasks. And there's this giant cave, and she's standing on the ridge of it looking down like at the abyss, and she has to like edge along it to get to the other side. And this is like standard cave work, I guess. But it's harder for her because her body doesn't quite do what she wants it to do. I think back to that moment on the ridge whenever I get to choose between comfort and excitement. Even being able to make a choice is a privilege because sometimes my body decides for me. On those days, I have to lie on the couch, ice my joints, and do my best to get some work done. I'm not comfortable or having fun. When I feel torn between saving my energy at home or spending energy on people or experiences that I love, I remember that I still had fun at the bottom of a cave on a bunch of muddy rocks and that it was worth it. I'm still disabled. I still have chronic pain, but I can also chase that joy whenever I can. So there's a lot of empowerment in that statement, in that story of being able to make those choices. So to sort of sum up, I gave you that overwhelming page of like all the stories. Our scientists had different disabilities, experiences, disciplines, genders, ages, races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, and more. Not all of it is reflected in their bios or their stories. We let them share what they wanted to share in their bios, which was actually interesting during the review period because one of the reviewers wanted people to sort of explicitly state like all their ethnicities and gender identity and stuff. And we were like, no, like we can give you sort of an anonymous survey to show that, you know, X percentage of our authors identify this way or that, but if they don't want to share that in their bio or their story, they don't have to. They should share what they want to share. I had a slide for another talk about this, but we paid our contributors. That was actually a really big deal because people don't always get paid for this kind of work. We actually got a grant to do that. And that was really important for us to make sure that they got paid for their work and not just sort of exploited for their really personal stories. So the common themes we did see as we culminate our qualitative data really from this book, we see a lot of ableism in academia and research. We see a lot of intersectionality, compounding discrimination for certain people. And then that means that there's a lot of need for advocacy work in this space because of the lack of support that they're experiencing. Support is really critical. However, even with the lack of support, a lot of them show creative problem solving and planning, which is really cool to see the skills that these people are developing. And they have a lot of resilience. Resilience can be good, but we shouldn't rely on it for everything. People should be able to not be resilient to just become a scientist. And there's a lot of exhaustion, though, fighting against an unsupportive system, right? Like, at some point, you know, you might decide to leave because it's too much on you. And the flip side of that is people get a lot of success if they get the right support, right? Success with support. But there's a lot of loneliness, not exclusively, but there's a fair amount of it that's expressed through the book. So it's been over a year since the book came out, and at the beginning, you know, everyone we knew and loved read it and gave us 5 stars, but on Goodreads, which you're probably familiar with, we're starting to get more like 4 and 3 stars, which is actually exciting because that means people that aren't just our best friends are reading it. And I just wanted to give you some sort of culmination from, there's 11 reviews, which not that many, but it's okay. Many reviewers commented on how diverse the collection was in terms of stories, which I was excited to hear from I don't know, random people on the internet, that they felt that it was a very diverse book. So that was really exciting. One reviewer was actually a faculty member who had just read this book in a diversity, equity, inclusion book club that semester, and they said that it really helped some faculty recognize ways in which disabled students and colleagues contend with barriers inside and outside the classroom in a way that they hadn't really got before. So that was really exciting that these personal stories were helping certain faculty members gain some more empathy with these situations. And some really identified with the authors, felt like it was written for them. I had one student reach out to me and I had a whole meeting with her, and she's like, wow, I didn't have any of these conditions. I have something else, but I felt exactly like they did. Like I've experienced this exact same thing. And that is really profound to me, that you don't have to have the same condition to have that same experience of feeling like, you know, you don't quite fit in, or, you know, something's not accessible, or, you know, maybe there's the joys of getting the support and access that you need. And I think that is honestly the most exciting part about people reading this book, is hearing that. Now, of course, some people wish there's more field and lab-based stories in here, but you know, we could only do so much. But they wanted more lab-based stories. Some people felt the writing was uneven at times. There's various skill levels of writing, but I think that was some of our hope with the diversity we're bringing to it. But they still found it interesting, you know. One person actually wrote that they thought that the title was misleading, which is fine. Disability is not in the title, so maybe that's why, but it's okay. So I'm really excited that people are reading this. Now, okay, this works. There is actually, since 2019, 2020, I have seen a whole slew of efforts come out online. There's lots of articles about people making efforts in labs to make space for people with disabilities in STEM. There's a whole research, there's a whole set of things being funded to research like how to make things more accessible. And there's a new, I don't know if it's a new or a modified NSF program to help students with disabilities tap into STEM. It's called Tap into STEM, I think. And then there's some research being done on how STEM fields should be more inclusive to those with cognitive disabilities, which is really interesting. That's something I found recently. There's been National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine had a huge thing online last summer. They wrote a bunch of reports. It's all online and accessible. It was a big summit on disabilities in STEM and ways to make things more accessible and improve the workforce. There's a lot of talks. And one thing I wanted to end on, chemistry is a really interesting field if you're deaf, because coming up with sign language for all the different chemicals is really hard because a lot of it doesn't exist. So there's a bunch of people that have been working on developing sign language for different compounds and different aspects in organic chemistry, as well as other types of chemistry. And this is true probably for some other fields too, but this article caught my attention today. A beautiful way of saying a lot. Sign language brings benefits to organic chemistry classroom. It also helps students with non-conventional learning needs. So actually, it was beneficial to more than those that were deaf, but other types of students as well. So if you're interested in where to go from here, if you're still interested in this topic, making time and space, slowing down to think about accessibility, ableism, and intersectionality are always a good idea. Listening to people with disabilities, listening and understanding often leads to better long-term solutions. Consider specifically reading resources on accessibility and not just stories about overcoming disabilities. That's a very common thing in our culture, like, oh my God, I can't believe they overcame this thing because our system was just so inaccessible, but they still did it because they have so much resilience and perseverance. It's about rethinking our systems to be more accessible and supportive for all people, because often when we come up with technology of ways of doing things that are more accessible for those with disabilities, it's actually better for everyone. So I'm gonna leave this plug in. If you're interested in reading Uncharted in a book club, we have discussion questions at the back of the book that are both general and section specific. Stories are super short, like you can read them really quickly, under 3,000 words. There's 2 suggested approaches for reading. One is you can split up stories and section among the group for each meeting. You can use questions to fuel the discussion. Maybe you can find commonalities or differences, but you don't have to read all the stories. You can just share what you've learned. Or you could pick a few of the same stories, or all of them, and read together and use the discussion questions too. But there's a lot of different things you can do, and you don't even have to read the whole book to get something out of it. And that's one thing I really like about books that are collections of stories. And then I have a bunch of resources. I don't know if these slides are accessible afterwards, but this is just a few resources. There's so many out there that I think are really a great place to start if this interests you. And finally, I just want to leave you with a quote by Judy Heumann. Change never happens at the pace we think it should. It happens over years of people joining together, strategizing, sharing, and pulling all the levers they possibly can. So thank you for listening, and I'm willing to take questions now. And I have no idea how much time I have left. Okay, we're good. All right. Thank you.
There we go. Is this microphone on? There we go. They don't usually give me the microphone, so this is exciting. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions right off the bat? If we want to just raise hands, I can walk the mic over to you. All right.
Thank you. It looks like you, the story contributors were a range of ages. And I'm just curious if those who were younger demonstrated that things have improved compared with those who were older? Did you get any sense that there was more acceptance, less bias among those younger who hopefully grew up in a little bit more enlightened and accepting age?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like for a lot of the younger contributors, a lot of it was still really hard. It was still really hard. There's some, exceptions, like for Umfo, getting a wheelchair was a huge deal. And so I would say things got easier in his, cultural sphere. For other people, I think less so, especially there were a lot of women who had like autoimmune or like invisible disabilities that really affected their energy level. That came up a lot where they felt they just couldn't keep up and there wasn't any understanding. We didn't have that many. We had a few older contributors, but honestly not that many, and they were hard to find, which tells you something. So maybe it's a little bit easier, right, just by that statistic. Like Richard Mankin is our oldest contributor, and he was born at a time where his parents could have decided not to send him to school because he was disabled. He was missing muscles in his legs and arms, so he had to walk with crutches a certain way his whole life. But they could have decided to just never send him to school. So things have definitely changed. But I think it's still really hard for certain people. But that's a really good question.
Any other questions? We got one over here. I'm going to come around that side.
What are some changes in like accessibility accommodations that you're hoping to see within the next like 5 to 10 years?
That's a great question. Me personally, I think one of the hardest things that I always contend with is I used to have like a radio show in college. The signal didn't leave the town, but I was like, man, podcasts are so great, like audio is so great. And then I started interacting with people in the deaf community, and they're like, if there's no transcript, it's completely inaccessible. And I'm like, because I was like, oh, podcasts are so great. So I really think like having universal like captioning is something that and actually a huge percentage of adults have some sort of hearing loss, which is why you should never just yell at a room. You should always use a microphone, even if people don't want to admit it. So captioning or like ways for auditory things to be accessible, my sense is based on some of the technology I've seen is that often like there's more technology in some ways for if you're vision impaired. I don't know that that's across the board though, because like accessing the internet and social media and stuff, it can still be quite hard if you're visually impaired. But I think especially those two, I would love to see, universal, partly because like most people develop some sort of auditory or vision impairment as we get older, or you don't even have to get older, right? We have glasses as like a universal thing. So I think that's something specific. I think there's so many other things that I haven't even thought of. I do think that figuring out ways to make things accessible for different situations, like having the time and space to make that a priority is something I'd like to see people do, like culturally, but it is hard, especially in like American culture where we're always in a hurry and work's the most important thing, and if you can't keep out, get out, and it doesn't have to be like that, because there's so much people can contribute if you just give them the support and time and space. But it can be really hard to say, like, I used to be a faculty member, and I would try to accommodate students as much as possible, but then I needed support too to be able to do that. So there's like often a dominoes effect where like at some levels, it's just like you want to be able to do everything you can, but then you need support to be able to do that. So then it becomes like a whole institutional and systematic thing that needs to change. So that was a long answer, but those are my thoughts.
All right, we got a question up front over here.
I think it was a slide back where you said something about slowing down and making space for that. So if someone were to start a new group, maybe it doesn't have to be STEM related, but a group, and what would you suggest setting the parameters from the very beginning?
I guess you'd want to know what the goal of the group is. If you want to like learn more about disability and accessibility, if that's the goal of the group, then I would probably start some sort of book club. If it's where you start reading resources and talking about it and figuring out what ideas you like and if there's something you want to apply to in your community. That's one thing. If you're trying to understand each other, right? You're like, I want to understand each other, then you can ask each other, open-ended questions and sort of figure out like ways that you like to work on things if you're working on something together and communicating a lot about it. So I think it kind of depends on the goals. I don't know if you had something specific in mind. No, just
Yeah, so I'm thinking of starting a group that would be talking about using music and talking about the environmental catastrophe that we're in, and sort of supporting each other through that, but it also to not have ableism and colonialism and in the group, like have it a safe place. That's where I'm thinking of going.
Yeah. I'd have to know more about I guess the music and environmental aspects, but I think talking about and educating yourselves on resources, and also, so let's say you have a group and you're like, well, we're all going to do this thing. It's like, well, is everyone able to do that? Can everyone access it the way you want it? Like, are those reasonable metrics for people? Sometimes it's not even about if someone's disabled, it's just some people are too busy to do the thing, right? But setting, when you decide to do something and you want everyone on board, asking can we do this? Can we accommodate your needs? And it gets tricky, and I didn't go into this, but some people have a hard time or don't want to be asked about their disability or condition, or it's hard. It can be tricky because not everyone wants to talk about it. Not everyone wants, the same treatment, which makes it hard. But a good place is probably to start maybe is just figuring out is everyone on board with this idea or this assignment or this thing we want to do? And that's probably a good place to start, is making it open. So I hope that kind of helps. Maybe.
Other questions? I actually had a question as well.
Yeah.
So in your themes, you were talking about how academia is largely ableist, and a lot of it's kind of just built into the way institutions are structured. I'm curious, as you were reading all these stories and submissions, did it seem more like academia was just innately inaccessible and people weren't able to air quotes overcome it in that way and just chose to leave? Or was it actively academia being resistant to any change and kind of pushing people out? I'm curious, was it just sort of a brick wall to to not push through, or was it actual resistance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on the case. I think some people it was a brick wall. It's just these are the standards to enter in, and you just don't qualify. Although I think everyone in our book was in the field of science at one point in their career. Not all of them stayed. Some have. Some, I don't know, because last we talked to them a couple years ago and they were still a student. But there are a couple of stories in there of people. There's one story, she used a pseudonym, actually. Actually, we had 3 people who did not use their names because they were afraid of retaliation. She she had a history of head injuries, and so she had, certain requirements, or like she couldn't last as long as things like exams, where you have to qualifying exams where you have to stand up and talk for like 2 hours straight, or like write exams for 3 hours or whatever. Like her brain couldn't handle it and she needed more rest. And her committee members, and she went to like the health services to like get accommodations, and her advisors told her not to tell the other students because then it would look like she was getting special treatment, even though she has these accommodations. And there are actually a couple stories of people being treated worse after they got formal accommodations. People were like, oh, we can't see who's being treated special. So I would call that active resistance. It's like, oh, you've declared this and are asking for help. We're gonna make it actually harder for you. And she also, I think she was the only female graduate student, and it was a math department at the time too. So she had that intersectionality as well that she was contending with. So it wasn't just the fact that she has head injuries, but she's also the only woman. So, I would call that active resistance. I'm sure there's some other examples too, but that is a really good question. 'Cause yeah, sometimes it's just like, nope, we can't do this. And that's actually why that article about the cognitive abilities was really interesting to me. Like, working in STEM doesn't mean you have to get a PhD. It doesn't mean you have to get a master's. And some people don't even get bachelor's degrees and can still do things that are related to science. It doesn't have to be just this like one academic path to contribute to the field. And I think that's a really important concept that maybe people are starting to open up, a bit more. I also think, though, that the way academia is set up is not for everyone. It was set up, the structure that came from Europe was for, a lot of really wealthy men who didn't have jobs, and that's what they did. They were professors, 500 years ago or whatever it was, and then that institute, that's what it came from. It's like, oh, I have a bunch of money, I'm gonna go study this for fun. I'm gonna go sail across the world and collect a bunch of snails and cut them up and then write a book, right? So like, they didn't have all these other responsibilities of like trying to make an income, like taking care of their kids or other relatives, or just like, I don't know, balancing their life, right? Like they could just do whatever and spend a lot of time playing in their intellectual sandbox and not worry about much. But that's not, if we're gonna be inclusive, we need to change that structure so we can include other people who don't just do that, so.
We have one in the back. All right.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question about whether or not your STEM group included like healthcare workers. Because if you notice, I don't know if anybody's been to a medical school, but they always have these photos of the classes of each graduating class. And I have never seen a mobility user in any of the photos. And so that also is one of those technical standards that you can't even enter with one of those. That is changing at like 2 medical schools, but I'm just wondering if you included any of those type of individuals as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I'm trying to remember, because some people I think were more maybe medically, but they were all in the lab, right? They're all like working in labs if they were, and a lot of the time their story didn't tend to focus as much on that, but they weren't, like I know one story, she was working in like a neurology type lab, but whether or not it was like specifically at a hospital or like a medical worker, I don't know. Probably not. There is actually on X, Twitter, I think it's like Docs with Disabilities or something. There's some specific disabilities and like medicine groups out there that I think kind of are doing their own thing. But your point is very well taken with like the photos and the not seeing mobility aids. And that is, probably an example of the brick wall Dallas was mentioning, where it's like, nope, this isn't for you. Like, you could maybe go to the lab bench, maybe, if it's the right height. that kind of thing, which actually matters, right? Like, is your bench accessible? All these things. Empho, like, the wheelchair was really good for him, but he had some stories of, like, his classmates literally carrying him upstairs in his wheelchair so that he could look at the telescope. And he was like, it was embarrassing, but also I'm really glad they were willing to do that, right? So it also, like, I feel like it's not just, like, structure and it's not just infrastructure, but it's also, like, the people around you. Like, are people willing to, like, rally around you, you know, and you can help them out too. It's not like you can't contribute anything if you're disabled. But that sense of like helping each other out and not just being only for yourself, I think is also something I'd like to see more in certain realms, certain cultural realms of science, and maybe medicine too.
Other questions? Okay, I do have one more. So, we've talked a little bit in your, discussion about, like, people may not realize they have a disability, they may not be thinking of it in those terms, but also that disabilities can develop at any real point in life. And so I'm just curious, like, if you, through the process of writing this book, hearing all these stories, having your own lived experience, if you have advice for people in STEM fields who are kind of coming to that realization or developing a condition of some sort, like, what would you tell them? What advice do you have?
Yeah, I'd say find support. I honestly think that, like, I mean, that's why we wrote this book, is so people would, like, we would feel less alone. Like, it was amazing, like, meeting all these authors and being like, oh my God, like, I had that experience too. And, like, we're here to support you through writing this and talking about it. And just, like, building community is the best thing you can do, is, like, getting support and having people to talk to about it. I mean, one thing that I really noticed when I was a PhD student, even when I did my master's, is like people didn't want to talk about their personal problems that much. And I was like, man, I want to talk about like how horrible my advisor is, or like, what do I do with this situation? Like, my dad had a stroke when I had when I was in my PhD program, and I needed people to talk about. Like, I just couldn't like not talk about it. And I'm so glad I did find people to talk to with it, because if you don't find community, and it doesn't have to be like other students, it could be something else. Like, I've always done sports. I did roller derby as a PhD student, and then I moved back into jiu-jitsu. But having some sort of community that you can feel supported by and like talk to about things and is just so key. And I think that's just a human condition for the most part. But in science, we like to pretend that I feel, maybe this isn't true for everyone, but I feel like there's a sense of like, oh, you got to do it alone and be like, figure it out yourself. And you don't. Like, science is actually a team sport. We make the best advances and decisions and changes by working as a team and not as individuals. So that's what I would say. Embrace the community. And it might be online, it might be in person, it might be something else, I don't know. But I gotta say, like, I don't like how Twitter's turned into X. But I will say I think there's still a disabled community on there that's quite active, because it's a really great tool to connect still for them. And that was such a helpful tool for me to find people to talk to that could like understand what I was going through with certain things. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. All right, any questions? Hands up, wave at me if you got one. Okay. Well, again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. And I'd like to again thank Dr. Bayer for coming and letting us know about her book, sharing all this wonderful story with us. We do actually have several copies of the book up here if you'd like to kind of take a sneak peek preview, kind of flip through some pages, ask individual questions that maybe you don't want to ask in front of the crowd. That's also okay. But yeah, thank everyone for coming out. And just if we give one more round of applause for Dr. Bayer.
Thank you. Really enjoyed this.